All right, so this is week 6. This is actually not going to directly align with what you'll learn in lab in week 6. So in lab, the lab tutor will take you through how to create a wireframe in Photoshop. So you're going to learn a little bit about Photoshop in lab. I wanted to make this video about dividing your HTML document into um, all of the main elements that every HTML document needs, and then talk a little bit about layouts and CSS. And so we talked about a lot of this in class already, but I just wanted to make a video so that for those of you that were a little bit behind or thought it was a little bit confusing, all of this information will be in a video for you. So that's what we'll do today. Before we get into uh, before we get into um, actually what we're going to do in HTML and CSS, I wanted to sort of point out what I mean by dividing your HTML page. So when you think about web pages visually, pretty much every web page has very similar elements, regardless of how they look, regardless of what content it is. We see a lot of similar elements, right? So you might call this top portion of my website here a header, and I've got my name and my title in the header. Um, I've also got an image in the header. All websites typically have some kind of navigation, so that's another major element in a website. All websites have some kind of area where their content is displayed, right? So here's an example in my website where the content is displayed in 3 columns. And then finally, most websites have footers, right? So places on the bottom of the page where you can find information like your contact information, information like links to your social media and other digital outlets. So regardless of what the content is, regardless of what the site actually looks like, you've got these key elements, right? And so if we look at another site like a news site, even a news site like CNN.com has these same elements, right? So you've got a header where you've got their logo and it's sort of branded at the top of the page. You've got a navigation bar. You've got an area where you've got all your content, all the news stories. And then you've got a footer where you've got like secondary navigation, copyright information, and links to some of their other sites. Okay, so all sites have common elements, and in these common elements typically include, they start with a header, and are often followed by some kind of navigation. There's always somewhere where you've got to have content, and there's always somewhere where you've got to have a footer, right? So all sites have these 4 things, regardless of what they look like. And so if all sites have these 4 things, it's important then for us to introduce these 4 things into our HTML files as tags. So that's what we'll concentrate on first here. So this is week 5's HTML. This is what it looked like after the week 5 video. And basically what I wanted to do then is I wanted to introduce at least those 4 elements. And so we already have a nav introduced. So what's cool about HTML5 is that a lot of the newer tags are very useful in dividing information or dividing your page up into multiple elements. So we've already got a nav tag. We don't have a header tag. And so just to remind you of what our site looks like, after week 5, this is kind of what our site looks like. We've got a nav tag, but we don't have anything for our header tag. So I'm going to create a tag called header. So in HTML5, there's a tag called header, which is to not be confused with the head tag, which you see up here. It's just indicating that, okay, what we have here is a header. And so right now, all I have in the header is an image. Maybe you might want to add some other things in the header. So common things you might put in your header are like the title of your site. So like my portfolio or whatever you call it. You probably use a more descriptive name. But those are the kinds of things you put in a header. Okay, so we've added our header, that's our first element. We already have a nav, that's our second element. Our third element is the content area. And so that sort of indicates everything that has content here, right? So in our content area, there's not a tag in HTML called content. So, but what's cool about HTML is we can create our own tags using divs and IDs. So if we were to create a div, which literally stands for division, we can divide or create a division within our page, within our entire HTML page. And we can use an ID to create a name for our own tag. So I might call this content, right? So let's say you've decided on a one-column layout and you wanted to create a division in your HTML document called content. Okay, so that's what this does. Div ID equals content. And we close a div by using this closing div tag. So we don't close it by putting \content. We don't do it by using the actual name of the ID. We just close the div by saying \div or /div, I'm sorry. Okay, so we've got 3 of our 4 elements. We've got our header here. We've got our nav here. We have our content area here. The last thing is we need a footer. We don't actually have any content in our footer, but let's create a footer. And HTML has a tag called footer conveniently, so that's already there for you. Okay, so in our footer, we would put things like contact information. So maybe email address, maybe a link to your Facebook, things like that. Okay, so I'm not going to flesh out what would go in the footer. I just put some dummy information or some dummy text in there so we have a footer. Okay, so now we have a footer. So now, just as a quick review, we've got our 4 elements of our page that pretty much all websites have. We've got our header, we've got our nav, we've got our content wrapped up in a div, and we've got our footer. Okay, so we save that. And what I do want to show you is, now that I've added all those elements, oops, that was not supposed to happen. I'm going to remove all my styles. Ignore that, I apologize. So now that we've added all those elements, the header, the nav, the content, and all of that, it doesn't actually do anything to the HTML, right? So it still looks exactly the same as if we didn't have those tags in there. But what I really want to point out is conceptually, if we didn't have those tags, we wouldn't be able to call on those tags in CSS and make changes to them. Okay. So what you'll learn today is you'll learn about wireframes in Lab. And wireframes are great because they sort of give you a blueprint for the structure, the overall structure of a single page on your website. And so the reason why I introduced these 4 major HTML elements is that we can actually now then in CSS lay out our page based on the wireframes we create. Okay, so let's just say I want my page to look a certain way in my wireframe. I can do that now because I've created these tags. So let's just quickly lay this site out, and hopefully you can follow along and this will be useful for you. So the first most obvious place to go is to our header first. So let's just go in order and lay out our site. So we want our header to maintain at the top because most headers are at the top of our page. So there's not really much we have to do about that. But one thing we can do is select header, and let's just change the background color of our header to blue. No, let's change it to gray. And so I'm just sort of pointing out to you, using background colors just to kind of show you the different elements. Okay, so now that we've created this tag called header, we can now manipulate the tag. And remember, every tag in HTML, every single tag is a rectangle, a different size rectangle. So what's important to understand now is that header is the parent element, and so that's this big gray rectangle. And everything inside are smaller rectangles, right? So H1 is also its own rectangle, my portfolio. And this image is also its own rectangle. And so if we wanted to, just for illustrative purposes, I could say, I want to change the header inside of my H1. I wanted to change the background color of it. You can see, okay, it's a smaller rectangle inside of a bigger rectangle, right? So my header H1 is, I've made blue. That's a smaller rectangle inside of a bigger rectangle, which is our nav. So, or which is our header. So that's important to know that all of these elements are essentially different rectangles. And so when we go to lay things out, I'm going to take that blue off. When we go to lay things out, knowing that everything is a rectangle is really useful for us, because then we can resize things how we want to resize them, right? So like maybe we decide we want our header to be much taller than it actually is appearing, right? We want a bigger header. Maybe we want to put like a big picture in the header. So what we can do now, knowing that it's a rectangle, is, since that's the default size of our header, we can increase the height of our header to 200 pixels. Okay, so we're selecting header, our property is height, and our value is 200 pixels. So you can see that made it a little bit bigger. Maybe we decide that's not even big enough. I want to go 400 pixels. I want a really big header, right? And so we've created a really big header. And so you can manipulate that rectangle based on your wireframe, right? So if you've built a wireframe and you've decided, okay, this is what I want my header to look like, now we can actually make that change in CSS by manipulating the rectangle, okay? So I think 400 is a little big. Let's go 300. And now let's lay out our navigation bar. So if we wanted to make our navigation bar is also a rectangle, and we can kind of see that if we change the background color to something like red, just for illustrative purposes again. So I wouldn't actually condone making this red. We can do that, right? And so now we've outlined the rectangle that is our nav. Let's just say we want our nav half the size of our header. If we wanted to do that, we could make it 150 pixels and it would be half the size of our header. Okay, very cool. Okay, so the next thing we want to do then is we want to move to our div ID content. Okay, so div ID content. And the way that we select IDs in CSS is a little different than just regular tags, right? So if you have just a tag called header, you just select it by typing in header. To select an ID, you have to do the £, and then the name of the ID. So to select this ID of content, we do £content, okay? And let's make the background color, just for illustrative purposes again, gray. Okay, and we can see there that our div ID content is there. And then let's finish with our footer. And let's do the background color red again, just for illustrative purposes. Okay, so now we've got all 4 of our elements laid out as rectangles, right? So I think that's important, sort of an important concept for you to understand, is that everything is a rectangle. So those four elements that we put into our HTML file at the beginning of this video are all just rectangles. So those are the four major rectangles in our site. And so based on your wireframe now, we can move these rectangles around and manipulate them in the ways that we would want to. Okay. One thing I did cover last week was this idea of a container tag. And container tags are really good for fixed width sites, right? So a fixed width site is, you say, I want this site to be 1280 pixels wide, no matter on what device we're using this on, an iPad or a computer, or what screen resolution it is. Doesn't matter, it's going to be 1280 pixels wide. And so there's lots of reasons why we want to do that. One, it's easy for layout. But the best way to do that, though, is we don't want to make the body of our the body tag 1280 pixels wide. And there's lots of reasons why, but the best reason is it doesn't work. And so instead, what we do is we create a div ID called container, or you can call it anything you'd like. Some people like to call it wrapper, not like the musical genre of rap, but wrapper, like you're wrapping a present. So whatever you want to call it, I like to use the word container because it contains things. And so if you open up a div ID container at the very beginning, right after our body opens, and close it right before our body closes, now we've created a tag that contains everything on our site. Okay, and what we can do with that now is we can select our ID container, and we can set the width of our container to be 1280 pixels. So now we can say our site is always 1280 pixels. And I forgot to save this document. There we go. So now that we've got a fixed width, you can see when I expand the size of the screen, the width of our container still stays 1280 pixels no matter what. Okay. And then just a little tip too is we want to center this. It doesn't look right when it's left aligned. So to center our container, we use a little trick called margin left auto and margin right auto. And basically what this is saying is the margin on the left-hand side of the screen, make it automatically the same as the margin on the right-hand side of the screen. So if we do that, you can see that now it centers our container. Okay, and it always stays 1280 pixels wide. Okay, so that's our basic layout. I want to talk briefly about margins and things, right? So what are these little white things in between these elements? Basically, they are default margins in between elements, right? And so we want to remove those. Or maybe we want to keep them depending on what your wireframe looks like or depending on what your design looks like. But typically we don't want, sometimes we don't want these spaces occurring. And so what we can do then is we can add, okay, that's not going to do it. I apologize. I am going to need to open this in Firefox so I can show you. I think I will save margins and padding for the next video, or I'll make a separate video about margins and padding, and we'll just leave off where we left off here. Okay, so the main takeaways that I want you to be familiar with from this video is a couple things. One, we've got to introduce all of the major elements as tags into our HTML. Okay, so we added those 4 major elements. And then the second thing is those 4 major elements now are just 4 rectangles that we can move around our site, right? Like, so if we wanted to make them side by side, or we wanted to move one up here or down here, we could do that, but we still would have to know these 4 rectangles exist. Okay, so that's the beginnings of layout. I'm going to deal with margins and padding in the next video. Until then, good luck.